A communal loaf of bread was passed from hand to hand down a long harvest table in Thornfield Magna, and 50 people broke off a piece. 50 people ate. Yet only one person died, the host himself, mid-toast, his crystal glass shattering against the oak table before he hit the floor. The bread had been shared. The bread had been safe. Unless, of course, it was never the bread at all. Unless the poison had been meant not for him, but for someone seated to his right. And unless the kindness of giving away the finest piece of a loaf for an old, sentimental village custom was the most precise delivery mechanism a murderer had ever devised. Hello friends, I'm Jack, coming to you from right here in Ohio, and welcome to Midnight Pages. Chapter 1, The Carved Bread Stamp. The harvest supper at Thornfield Magna was an institution of such unbending rigidity that the villagers often joked one could set a watch by the arrival of the vicar's wife, the ordering of the first jug of cider, and the moment Edmund Hartley Vane cleared his throat to begin his annual speech. These events occurred in sequence, year after year, with the reliability of a church clock and rather less charm. The marquee on the village green had been erected 2 days prior by a team of sweating men from Chipping Tollerton. It was a great canvas structure, flapping softly in the brisk October wind that had come rolling in from the west, carrying with it the smell of turned earth and wet hay. Inside, long trestle tables groaned under the weight of the harvest bounty, roasted meats glistening under their juices, mountains of glazed parsnips and carrots, great flagons of local cider that smelled sharply of fermented apples and coopered wood. The gas lamps hissed along the ridge of the tent, throwing a warm, unsteady yellow light across the assembled faces of the village 60 people or so, dressed in their careful best, speaking in the particular way that English villages speak when the landlord is within earshot. Edmund Hartley Vane sat at the head of the long oak table in a high-backed master's chair, a chair that by all appearance had been designed to make whoever sat in it look slightly regal and anyone who looked at them feel slightly diminished. Edmund was a man in his late 60s who had mastered this effect without the aid of the furniture. He was constructed of ruddy complexion, a loud voice, and the absolute unshakable conviction that his generosity toward the village, which was real and considerable, absolved him of any obligation to be bearable. He had funded the supper entirely from his own deep pockets. He had mentioned this fact for times before the soup was even cleared. He would, Miss Marple suspected, mention it again before the evening was done. She sat near the middle of the long table, an inconspicuous elderly lady in a grey cardigan who had been brought along by the vicar's wife as a companion and had since been entirely forgotten about, which was precisely how she preferred it. Miss Jane Marple, of St. Mary Mead, was possessed of pale blue eyes that were much sharper than the general impression of fluffy white hair and mild interest would suggest, and she had spent the first half of the evening observing the room with the quiet pleasure of a naturalist identifying species in a familiar habitat. To Edmund's right sat his younger brother, Gerald Hartley Vane, recently returned from 10 years in Ceylon. Gerald was thin, sallow, and wore his stiff collar like a penance. He jumped whenever a serving girl set down a plate too sharply. He had not wanted to come tonight. Miss Marple had heard him say so to the vicar, quietly, by the door, before they were seated, but Edmund had insisted, the way Edmund insisted on everything, loudly, and with the implication that refusing would be ungrateful. Gerald was this year's guest of honor. It was the custom. Before Edmund, at the very center of the table, sat the harvest loaf. It was a magnificent creation, Agnes Prentice's finest, as every loaf she produced was. Golden and heavily crusted, it had been shaped with exact precision, and pressed deep into its center was the Hartley Vane family crest, a sheaf of wheat. The impression was so clean, so sharp at its edges, that it seemed almost to float above the surface of the bread rather than sit within it. It had been pressed there that morning by the carved wooden bread stamp that Agnes had kept for 40 years, a dense, solid block of pear wood, the handle worn smooth by decades of pushing down into dough. Edmund rose. He tapped his silver spoon against his crystal wine glass. The chatter died instantly, replaced by that particular silence English villages produce when the landlord asks for it, attentive, polite, and containing multitudes. "My friends," Edmund began, his voice rolling out with the practiced cadence of a man who had given this speech, in various forms, for 30 years. "Another year. Another bountiful harvest. We have weathered the uncertainties of spring and the heat of summer, and we reap today the rewards of honest English toil." He paused to allow the gravity of this observation to settle. "Tradition dictates that we break the bread and share it as one community. As it was for my father, as it shall be for his son." He reached down toward the loaf. The decorative wheatsheaf crust, the raised crown of the bread, pressed in with the family stamp, had been, since before anyone living could remember, the portion given to the guest of honor. It was broken off separately from the rest, presented with a small bow, and the receiving of it was considered a mark of esteem. Gerald's hand moved almost imperceptibly forward on the tablecloth, the ghost of a reaching gesture. Edmund's large, rough hands closed over the wheatsheaf crust. Miss Marple watched with mild surprise as, instead of lifting and passing it to his brother, Edmund broke the entire decorative piece free with a sharp, definitive crack, the sound very loud in the quiet tent, held it aloft for a moment as though it were a prize cup, and then broke a portion off for himself and placed it into his mouth. Gerald blinked. His hand lowered back to his lap. His face flushed dull red, then went carefully blank. "To Thornfield Magna," Edmund roared, washing down the crust with a generous swallow of wine. He pushed the loaf down the table. It went from hand to hand. Clifford Renshaw, the estate manager, taking a piece with his nervous, sweating fingers, the Reverend Harold Goss, whose expression held the rigid charity of a man eating at the table of someone he had recently quarreled with, Dorothy Tanner, who tore off a hunk with the air of a woman owed considerably more than bread, Agnes Prentice herself, sitting quietly at the far end, breaking off a modest crumb of her own creation. Edmund swallowed. He raised his glass higher. He opened his mouth to continue the toast. No words came. The sound that escaped him instead was terrible, a strangling, desperate contraction, not a word, not a cry, but the sound a man makes when his body refuses the simplest command. His face, which had been red and triumphant a moment before, went through several colors very rapidly. His eyes fixed on some point in the canvas above the table with an expression of profound, confused outrage. The crystal wine glass slipped. It struck the edge of the oak table and shattered, sending a spray of dark red across the linen. Edmund clutched his chest, staggered backward, one hand seizing the tablecloth as he went, and brought down a section of the table's worth of plates and flagons in a tremendous crash of metal and broken crockery. He hit the floor with a sound that was not quite a collapse and not quite a fall, but something worse than either. Dr. Fenchurch, the village doctor, who had been seated 3 places down, was on his feet before anyone else had quite understood what they were seeing. "Stand back! Stand back! Give him air!" He went to his knees beside Edmund, his medical bag dragged from beside his chair, and conducted a rapid examination that took no more than 90 seconds. When he stood, his face told the table everything before his mouth did. Edmund Hartley Vane, by the time the constable arrived and the last of the screaming subsided, was entirely, unequivocally dead. Chapter 2: The Loaf That Passed Round. The shock that reverberated through Thornfield Magna was of a peculiarly complicated kind. It was not uncomplicated. Grief for Edmund had been complicated, but rather the shock of a community confronted with an impossible fact. A man had died in plain sight of 60 witnesses. They had all eaten from the same loaf. None of them were ill. The question of how the thing had been done attached itself to the village like a burr to a wool coat, and by 9 o'clock the following morning it had driven a substantial portion of the population out of their cottages to stand in small, agitated clusters on the green. Inspector Bramley arrived from the county constabulary at 9:30. He was a broad-shouldered man with a bristling grey moustache, a bowler hat, and an expression of deep professional suspicion that he wore as a doctor wears a stethoscope constantly, and with the implication that this was the appropriate tool for all occasions. He had set up his temporary headquarters in the drawing-room of Hartley Vane House, a room heavy with dark oak panelling and the smell of beeswax and old dog. The remnants of the harvest loaf sat in a sealed metal evidence tin on the mahogany table. Bramley circled it as he might circle a suspect. 57 people ate from that loaf, he said, addressing his sergeant, who was taking notes at a side table. I have had Dr. Fenchurch examine 6 of them this morning. Not a trace of illness. Not a stomach cramp, not a headache, not so much as a foul taste in anyone's mouth. Yet the master of the house drops dead of acute aconitine poisoning before the toast is even finished. You tell me, Sergeant, how a poison lives in a loaf and kills exactly 1 man. It couldn't, sir, the sergeant said cautiously. No. It couldn't. Bramley turned. He was somewhat startled to find a small elderly lady sitting in the wingback chair by the window, half obscured by the heavy velvet drapes, knitting something pink with considerable industry. He had entirely forgotten she was there. You are Miss Marple. Jane Marple. I am staying with the Gosses, Inspector, and I accompanied Mrs. Goss when she came to give her statement. I do hope I am not in the way. Not at all, said Bramley, in the tone of a man who slightly hoped she was. Well, then. What do you make of it? Miss Marple looked up from her knitting with an expression of mild apology. I would not presume to impose upon your professional investigation, Inspector. But I was at the table, and I was watching rather closely, as one does at these events. It occurs to me that there were 2 separate things on that table last night. The bread itself, the loaf proper, which was shared among everyone, and the decorative wheatsheaf crust, which was a separate element. Pressed into the surface separately, by all appearances, and of a slightly different texture to the loaf beneath it. Bramley stared. He opened the evidence tin, lifting the lid. The crumbs inside were modest, the remnants of whatever had been on the platter beyond the main loaf itself. The crust. He took the crust. He didn't pass it. He did not, Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. It is the village custom to give the wheatsheaf crust to the guest of honor. Mr. Hartley Vane departed from that custom in rather a striking manner. He took it himself. A long silence fell over the room. Bramley sat down very slowly. If the poison was only in the crust, and only in the crusts, not the body of the loaf at all, then everyone else was perfectly safe from the moment they sat down. The loaf was never the weapon. The crust was. He rubbed his moustache. Which changes everything about the motive. Doesn't it? It rather does, Miss Marple said, resuming her knitting. Bramley paced in a long, slow line across the Persian rug. We have several candidates. First, Clifford Renshaw, the estate manager. Embezzling from the estate accounts £300 over 2 years. Edmund had discovered it last week. An audit was scheduled for Monday. Prison was a very real possibility for Renshaw. A powerful motive, Miss Marple allowed. Second, Dorothy Tanner. Runs the village shop. Edmund's son Rupert was engaged to her 15 years ago. Edmund paid to have the boy sent to India, and Rupert died there of fever 2 years later. She has hated Edmund ever since with a consistency and passion that has become something of a village institution in itself. Grief and bitterness together are a particularly adhesive combination, Miss Marple observed. Third, the Reverend Harold Goss. Edmund blocked his church extension. The land was part of the estate boundary, and Edmund refused to sell or grant right of way. They had a public quarrel on the green last month. Bramley paused. And fourth, Gerald Hartley Vane. Edmund had no wife. His son is dead. Gerald inherits the estate. A very large estate. A very large estate, Miss Marple echoed. And Gerald was to have been the guest of honor. The recipient of the wheatsheaf crust. She said no more than that. But the needles clicked steadily in the quiet room, and Bramley stood at the window staring at the village green, thinking about the inheritance, and the custom, and the crust. Chapter 3, A Baker's Private Joke. Miss Marple was in the habit of purchasing bread. It was, she had always found, one of the more reliable reasons to visit a bakery, which in turn was one of the more reliable places to find a village's real opinion of recent events, unfiltered by the presence of inspectors or clergymen. The bell above the door of Prentice's bakery tinkled with cheerful indifference to the events of the previous evening as she stepped inside. The shop was small, low-ceilinged, and warmly fragrant yeast and warm sugar and the ghost of baked apple. The counters held a modest morning stock, a dozen plain loaves, some seed cakes, a few iced buns. Behind the counter, Agnes Prentice was wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron with the slow, deliberate movements of a woman for whom time had never been an adversary. Agnes was in her mid-70s, her face mapped with a lifetime of fine lines, her grey hair pulled back in a severe bun beneath a white cap. She was not a woman who smiled readily, nor one who seemed to find the absence of a smile uncomfortable. She had served Thornfield Magna its daily bread for 40 years with the same silent competence, and she watched Miss Marple enter with the expression of a woman who has served the village long enough to know that its visitors always want something beyond what they ask for. Good morning, Mrs. Prentice. I hoped you might have a couple of those Chelsea buns, the Reverend Goss is particularly fond of them. 2 left. Agnes reached in with silver tongs. The bell above the door rang again. Oliver Tanner entered, Dorothy's nephew, tall and earnest, with ink stains on his left cuff from his position at Messrs. Harlow and Sons on the High Street. He carried himself with the slightly self-conscious air of a young man who knows he is being observed, and he offered Miss Marple a polite, somewhat distracted smile before turning toward the counter, or rather, toward the back room beyond the counter, where Agnes's granddaughter, Clara, was lifting a stack of flour tins from a low shelf. Clara Prentice was a quiet girl of 22 or so, with dark hair pulled back and pale, very still hands. She looked up as Oliver entered, and the quality of the room changed in some small, imperceptible way, the way the temperature of a room changes when a window is opened, before anyone has consciously registered the draft. Just the usual loaf, please, Mrs. Prentice, Oliver said, his voice a shade lower than necessary. Agnes nodded, reaching for the brown paper. Miss Marple, in the unhurried way that is the great advantage of being neither young nor in a hurry, allowed her gaze to drift across the counter to the corkboard pinned to the wall behind the till. Among the jottings and the receipts and the small, curling advertisements for the Women's Institute Harvest Collection, there was a recipe card. Handwritten in a cramped, old-fashioned copper plate. Somewhat scorched along the bottom edge, as though it had once been near a heat source. What a perfectly charming recipe, Miss Marple said, in the conversational way one comments on wallpaper. The handwriting is lovely. Is it a family card? Agnes's hands paused on the brown paper. Just for a moment. My grandmother's. A joke of hers, really. She had an odd sense of humor, old bakers often do. Miss Marple read the visible line aloud, mildly, as though reading a hymn board, 2 pounds strong flour, but never more than 4 ounces of malice, well folded. She made a small sound of appreciative amusement. Oh, how delightful! Rather like saying one must fold one's feelings into the dough. One's frustrations improve the crust, I've always thought. Though I could never get mine quite right. Just so, Agnes said. She turned, handed Oliver his bread. Her expression held a complete, careful stillness, not the stillness of someone who is empty, but of someone who is very, very full, and has learned to hold it all in. Oliver took the bread, cast one last look at Clara, who looked back with the same quality of attentive calm. She turned on everything and left, the bell announcing his departure. Miss Marple paid for her buns and remarked, as she did up the buttons of her cardigan, that the village must be quite shaken by the terrible events of the evening. Mr. Hartley Vane was the master, Agnes said simply. He was as he was. She offered nothing more. Miss Marple stepped out into the October air with her paper bag and her thoughts. 4 ounces of malice, well folded. Baker's jokes were one thing. But the card had been there a long time, the paper was old, the ink faded at the edges. One did not keep jokes for decades unless the joke had become something else, a monument, perhaps. A private memorial to something that would not be spoken of aloud. Miss Marple had lived in a village all her life. She knew the difference. Chapter 4: Oh, the Guest of Honor's Chair. That afternoon, the great canvas marquee on the green remained cordoned off with thick rope, a constable guarding its entrance with the expression of a man who wished he were anywhere else. The October wind had picked up, snapping the canvas in irregular, gunshot-like cracks. The trestle tables were still inside, still laid with the wreckage of the previous evening, toppled flagons, a drift of scattered cutlery, the stain of red wine on linen that had gone dark and stiff overnight. Miss Marple, who had been taking the air on the green on no business at all, found Dorothy Tanner and the Reverend Harold Goss standing outside the rope near the marquee entrance, conducting the sort of hushed, urgent conversation that village people conduct when they wish to appear grief-stricken but are actually somewhat galvanized. The Reverend, it must be said, looked better than he had looked in some months. He had the buoyancy of a man from whose shoulders a significant weight had been removed while he slept. He was making every effort to conceal this, which meant that his expressions of solemn concern arrived slightly after the appropriate moment, like a dubbing that is 1 second behind the picture. "It is a very terrible business," he was saying, rubbing his hands together. "The ways of Providence are not for us to question, Dorothy. We must accept what comes." "What comes," Dorothy said briskly, "is that Clifford Renshaw is going to spend the next week pointing the finger at everyone else in the village to keep it off himself." Dorothy Tanner was a handsome woman of 45 whose features might have been called striking if her expression did not so consistently suggest that she had just been presented with a bill she considered excessive. She wore a severe grey tweed coat and had the bearing of someone who has been aggrieved long enough to consider it a permanent state of being. "Did you see how he was hovering near the bread table before the supper? Shaking like a leaf." "One must not make accusations without evidence," the Reverend said, "but without great conviction." "I make observations," Dorothy corrected. "He had access to the food tent all afternoon. He arranged the seating. He knows where every fork and platter was going." Miss Marple, who had drawn up beside them with the unhurried air of a woman enjoying the fresh air, said mildly, "Forgive me for interrupting. I have been wondering. I was seated rather far from the head of the table, and I am afraid I am not entirely clear on the significance of the bread crust. Is it a tradition here? The decorative piece." Dorothy turned on her with the contained irritation of someone interrupted mid-lecture, then paused, recognizing Miss Marple as the vicar's guest. "The wheatsheaf crust," she said, with the patience of one explaining the obvious to a foreigner. "It's always been the custom. The baker presses the family crest into the top of the harvest loaf separately, builds it up out of dough, practically, with the stamp, and when the loaf is presented, that decorative crust is broken off first and given to the guest of honor. A mark of respect. It has nothing to do with eating, really. Most guests of honor just hold it, or break a tiny piece. But it is a gesture. It has always been a gesture." "And this year's guest of honor," Miss Marple prompted. "Gerald, of course. First time he's been back in 10 years. Edmund had every intention of making a fuss of him publicly. You know how Edmund was. He loved an occasion to be magnanimous, because the magnanimity always reflected so beautifully upon himself." Dorothy's voice sharpened. "Except that at the last moment, Edmund picked up the crust for himself. I have never in 30 years of attending that supper seen anyone do such a thing." The Reverend nodded, adjusting his spectacles. "Most irregular." Gerald put his hand out, and Edmund simply didn't notice, or didn't care to. He ate the whole decorative piece himself. It was quite he searched for the word. Observed. Miss Marple thanked them and walked on. The autumn wind carried the smell of wood smoke from the cottage chimneys. She pulled her shawl tighter and thought about the geometry of the thing. The murderer had baked the poison into the crust, expecting it to be given, as custom dictated, to the guest of honor. Gerald had been in the chair. Gerald should have eaten it. Edmund had seized it instead, not from any suspicion or any knowledge, but from the same proprietary vanity that had defined his entire relationship with Thornfield Magna. He had taken the finest piece because he always took the finest piece. And in doing so, he had walked into a trap laid for someone else. This changed everything. The investigation was pursuing the wrong man. Inspector Bramley's motive candidates, Renshaw, Dorothy, the vicar, were all people who had reason to hate Edmund. But the murderer had not meant to kill Edmund. The murderer hated Gerald. And Gerald had been in Thornfield Magna for exactly 3 days. What had Gerald done, or what had been done in Gerald's name, long enough ago to grow into something that looked like this? Chapter 5: What Clifford Renshaw Stood to Lose. Inspector Bramley liked a clear line of sight from motive to method, and for the better part of 48 hours, Clifford Renshaw had seemed to provide an admirably clear one. The man was guilty of embezzlement, that much was confirmed by the London accountants. He had been discovered. He had access to the supper preparations. He was frightened. These were the raw materials of a perfectly serviceable murder. Miss Marple, returning from the green, passed the churchyard lychgate at the moment Inspector Bramley was in the middle of what could charitably be called an intensive interview with the estate manager. Renshaw was pressed against the stone pillar of the gate as though hoping to pass through the rock itself. "You were at the marquee all afternoon," Bramley said flatly. "You arranged the seating. You supervised the table. You had every opportunity." "I didn't touch the bread." Renshaw's voice cracked into something close to falsetto. He was a thin man in a suit that had never quite fitted, and he was sweating despite the cold air. "Why would I do it? Killing Edmund doesn't stop the audit. The solicitors know. The London firm knows. If anything, killing him makes it all worse. It brings every authority in the county down here at once. It would have been madness." "Desperate men act madly," Bramley said. "I'm not a desperate man," Renshaw said, with the air of someone who is very much a desperate man. "I'm an embezzling one, which is entirely different. I was going to confess. I had already drafted the letter." He plunged a shaking hand into his breast pocket and produced a crumpled envelope. "On Monday morning. Before the audit. Because a voluntary confession reduces the penalty. I had taken legal advice. Killing Edmund would have destroyed everything." Bramley took the envelope. His moustache twitched. That evening, at the vicarage drawing-room, a sombre tea was assembled. Gerald sat by the empty fireplace, turning his watch chain through his fingers. Dorothy Tanner, also invited, had positioned herself by the window as though surveying the territory. The Reverend Goss moved between them with plates of sandwiches, doing pastoral duty. Miss Marple found Gerald alone by the hearth for a moment and approached with a cup of tea. "You must be exhausted," she said. "The shock of such a thing, and so soon after your arrival." "I ought not to have come back," Gerald said, without looking up. "I said as much to Edmund, before we sat down. There are things here I would rather not face. People I would rather not see." He turned his cup in his saucer. "The police look at me as if I've already been tried. I had the most obvious motive of anyone. I inherit the estate. But I wouldn't have, or I had no reason to hate Edmund. We were not close, but I didn't hate him. You appear," Miss Marple said gently, "to be a man who carries a considerable weight, Mr. Hartley Vane. And not the weight of your brother's death." His eyes came up sharply. For just a moment, something moved across his face, not guilt, exactly, but the look of someone who has been carrying something so long that they have ceased to be surprised when it shows, but have not ceased to feel the exposure of it. He said nothing. Across the room, Oliver Tanner had appeared in the doorway, come to collect Dorothy, presumably, and Clara Prentice had arrived with him, uninvited but unchallenged. They sat together on the window seat at the far end, not quite close enough to touch, saying very little. But the quality of their silence was different from the silence in the rest of the room. It was a comfortable silence, a chosen one. It had no weight in it at all. Miss Marple glanced at them occasionally throughout the evening, finding it a small relief. Later, walking back toward the vicarage, Clara pressed Oliver's arm and said, very quietly, into the dark, she was awake the night before. Sitting in the kitchen in the dark. The ovens were cold. She was just sitting there, holding something. I don't know what. Oliver said nothing for a moment. Then, she was probably just worried about the supper. It was a big occasion. Yes, Clara said. And then, yes, I expect so. Chapter 6, The Prove and the Patience. On the third morning after Edmund Hartley Vane's death, Miss Marple returned to the bakery ostensibly for a tin of shortbread. The shop was empty when she entered. Agnes was in the back, and the door between shop and kitchen stood slightly ajar, admitting a ribbon of warm, flowery air. The corkboard behind the till had rearranged itself in one small detail. A butcher's receipt that had partially obscured the lower half of the recipe card had fallen to the counter below, and the full text of Fragment 2 was now visible. Miss Marple leaned forward, just slightly. Her lips moved without sound as she read. Prove for exactly as long as a grudge will keep 29 years, 4 months. The shop was quiet. The gas lamp on the counter made a faint hissing noise, very steady. Outside, a cart horse's hooves rang on the cobbles and then faded. 29 years and 4 months. Miss Marple knew a great deal about specific numbers. Vague numbers, years, a long time, ages ago, meant nothing much, because human beings are imprecise creatures who soften their memories instinctively. But a specific number, 29 years and 4 months, meant that someone had been counting. Someone had kept a calendar of their grievance, noting not merely its age but its exact duration, as a prisoner marks the walls of his cell. She was reminded very vividly of Mrs. Higgins. Not the village gossip Mrs. Higgins, who had died peacefully 10 years ago, but the other one, the one whose name Miss Marple had never been able to forget, because she had found the case so instructive. A gardener's wife in a hamlet outside St. Mary Mead. A quiet, unassuming woman who had kept a ledger of her bulb plantings in the potting shed, or so she had said, for 15 years. The dates in the ledger corresponded not to planting seasons, nor to the phases of the moon, but to the precise days on which her husband had been wronged by a local magistrate in a property dispute, each slight recorded, each indignity noted, with the meticulous care of a scholar who intends to make use of her research. When the thing came to a head, the method had involved a very concentrated weed killer slipped into the magistrate's thermos at a parish council meeting, and the ledger had served as a perfect retrospective confession. It had taken Miss Marple an afternoon to decode it, and several months before she had been able to make herself feel anything but a deep, sorrowful admiration for the patience that had sustained it. Patient people were the most dangerous. They never boiled over. They waited for the precisely correct vessel and they poured into it with extraordinary care. When Agnes came through from the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a damp cloth, Miss Marple purchased her shortbread and remarked, quite conversationally, how long she had been baking for the village. 40 years, Agnes said. And your husband? Thomas, I believe I heard someone mention him yesterday. A tenant farmer. Agnes stopped. Her hand stilled on the cloth. She stared at the counter surface with the focused gaze of someone looking at something that is not in the room. Thomas was a good man, she said. The best of men. We lost the farm, long ago. He didn't last after that. I'm so terribly sorry. When was that, if I might ask? 29 years ago last April. Agnes looked up. Her eyes were perfectly dry. They were also the most tired eyes Miss Marple had ever seen in a living face. 29 years and 4 months, Miss Marple. The gas lamp hissed. Miss Marple folded the shortbread tin under her arm. She thanked Mrs. Prentice and stepped out into the brisk October air, and she stood for a moment with her hand on the latch of the bakery door, feeling the full weight of what she now understood. Chapter 7: 3 Conversations Before Dinner. The Reverend Goss's drawing-room held, that evening, a gathering so saturated with concealed motive and unspoken history that Miss Marple found it almost distractingly rich. Tea had been provided, and cucumber sandwiches, and a plate of Agnes Prentice's seed cake which nobody ate, for reasons that seemed to pass unexamined. The Reverend himself moved through the room with the particular energy of a man whose principal obstacle in life has been removed and who is making every effort not to let this show. His church extension, blocked for 4 years by Edmund's refusal to release the boundary land, could now presumably proceed. He was speaking of God's mysterious purposes at a volume that suggested he found them highly satisfactory. Dorothy Tanner had positioned herself by the window and was holding court with a directness that the drawing-room's other occupants were receiving with varying degrees of resignation. Renshaw is the man, she was saying to Mrs. Fenchurch, the doctor's wife. He had the opportunity and he had the motive, and he is precisely the sort of man who takes a shortcut when he ought to take the hard road. She paused. Edmund was not a good man. But no one deserved to die mid-toast. You feel that? Miss Marple murmured, from the chair to Dorothy's left. Dorothy turned. I feel that anyone who wanted Edmund Hartley Vane dead had 30 adequate reasons before they got to murder, she said flatly. He blocked my niece from inheriting her father's shop by contesting the will. He raised the rent on the Tanner plot. He sent Rupert away. Something crossed her face that was older than anger, a bruise of something, quiet and still. Rupert died in India. He was 27. I was told in a letter. Edmund offered his condolences at the harvest supper that year. He actually sat at this same table and offered his condolences, as though he had not been the cause of it. She looked away. So yes. I understand why someone might want him dead. I simply didn't do it. Across the room, Gerald had retreated to the far chair and was allowing the vicar's wife to present him with tea and sandwiches without showing any awareness of this fact. He looked like a man performing the actions of social attendance from a very great distance. Miss Marple drifted toward him after a polite interval. "I hope you are resting a little, Mr. Hartley Vane." "Not especially." He turned the teacup in his saucer. "I shall not stay much longer in Thornfield Magna. There is nothing to keep me here now. The solicitors will manage the estate. I will return to London." "Running away again?" Miss Marple asked, her voice perfectly mild. The cup stopped moving. "I beg your pardon." "Forgive me." It was rather blunt. "But you mentioned before that you returned to Thornfield Magna with reluctance. That there were things here you would rather not face. People you would rather not see." She paused. "You have been away 10 years, Mr. Hartley Vane. What drove you away in the first place?" The silence stretched. Gerald's jaw worked once. "Old business," he said finally. "Old, settled business. A quarrel about a farm. A debt case. I gave evidence in court, evidence that the court accepted and the farm was lost. It was legal. It was done." He set down his teacup. "It was done, and I have not thought about it since, because there was nothing to think about." "The Prentice farm?" Miss Marple asked gently. Gerald's face did something quite involuntary. "How do you know that name?" "Mrs. Prentice baked the harvest loaf," Miss Marple said simply. "She is rather well known in the village." Gerald said nothing more. But he left 20 minutes later without saying goodbye to anyone, and the look on his face as he went was that of a man who has just been handed a piece of information he had been careful, for a very long time, not to think about. Chapter 8: What the Weights Really Measured. The mist lay heavy on Thornfield Magna at 8 o'clock in the morning, and when Miss Marple entered the bakery it appeared empty. The bell announced her, and Agnes's voice came from the kitchen, 2 minutes. The shop was cool, the day's baking not yet underway. Miss Marple waited by the counter. The kitchen door stood ajar. She could see the large central table, flour-dusted and broad, the sort of table a serious baker needs. And on it, set squarely in the middle, sat the carved bread stamp. She did not move toward it immediately. She looked at it for a moment from the doorway. It was a solid, dense piece of pear wood, the handle worn smooth at the center where Agnes's palm had rested 10,000 times. The carving of the wheatsheaf was precise and deep, clearly the work of a craftsman, and it bore the marks of decades of use, small cracks in the grain, a ghost of grease absorbed from dough, the slightly uneven wear of the design where one particular spoke of the carved wheat had been pressed harder, 10,000 times, than the rest. She stepped into the kitchen. She picked up the stamp. It was heavier than she had expected, and warm in a way that would hold warmth, or not the warmth of a recent fire, but something older, ambient, absorbed. Her eyes went to the corkboard above the kneading trough. This was not the public board, this was Agnes's private kitchen, and the card pinned here was different from the one in the shop, or rather, it was a third fragment, torn from the same original sheet. Fragment 3 read, "Add decoration at 4 parts per 100, enough to mark the occasion properly." Miss Marple stood very still. She was doing arithmetic, and the arithmetic was dreadful. For ounces of malice. For grams, properly measured, for chemists' precision concealed in a baker's joke. Monkshood aconitine grows in hedgerows and damp corners the length of England. It is purple and pretty and deadly if one knows the extraction. For parts per 100 in a small quantity of decorative dough, enough to kill, concentrated in the crust, nothing remaining in the loaf below. Baked in at low heat so the compound did not entirely degrade. Pressed with the family crest into the top of the loaf, as it had always been pressed, as Agnes had pressed it every year for 40 years. She placed the bread stamp back on the table, exactly as she had found it. She had known, since the bakery conversation about Thomas and the farm, who had done it. She had known, since reading Fragment 2, why, and over what duration. Now she knew precisely how. The fourth fragment, or wherever it was, would be the complete confession. But she did not need it. She could see the whole card now as clearly as if it hung before her. Chapter 9: The Wrong Man Cleared. At midday on the 4th day after Edmund's death, Thornfield Magna erupted in the particular form of agitated gossip that a village reserves for the collapse of its working theory. Clifford Renshaw had been cleared. Completely, unambiguously, and Miss Marple suspected, rather to the inspector's private irritation. He had been in the Red Lion at Chipping Tollerton from 4 o'clock the previous afternoon until well past 10 in the evening, in a state of progressive intoxication witnessed by the landlord, the local constable, who had been called to pour him into a taxi, and 3 other patrons whose identities had been verified. He had not been within a mile of the marquee during the preparation hours. His drafted letter of voluntary confession had been written 3 days before the supper and bore a solicitor's notation. Inspector Bramley sat on the bench by the war memorial on the green, his bowler hat in his hands, looking like a man who has lost his map. Miss Marple sat beside him. It seemed the charitable thing to do. "He's out," Bramley said, not looking at her. "Completely, watertightly out." Which means Dorothy Tanner, the vicar, Gerald Hartley Vane, and the baker are all that remain. And I have not one shred of evidence against any of them that would hold 5 minutes in a courtroom. "I wonder," Miss Marple said, "whether you might ask your sergeant to look at the county court records from 1893. Specifically, a debt and lease dispute involving a Thomas Prentice of Thornfield Magna. A farm that was lost on the evidence of a witness whose testimony was rather central to the case." Bramley looked at her sideways. His moustache made a slow, twitching movement. 1893. 29 years ago last April, Miss Marple said. There is a recipe card in the bakery that uses a very specific figure. Bakers who write specific figures in their private notes are, in my experience, recording something they do not wish to forget. Bramley was quiet for a long moment. A rook landed on the edge of the war memorial and regarded them with ancient disdain before departing. The witness in the Prentice case, Bramley said slowly, working it through. Would that have been? I believe, Miss Marple said, that it may have been Edmund Hartley Vane. A young man, at the time. Under family pressure, one would imagine. The estate had an interest in the outcome. The Prentice land was adjacent to the main holding, and would have consolidated the estate considerably if the lease was forfeit. She paused. Thomas Prentice lost the farm. Lost his livelihood. Did not long survive the loss. His wife has baked the bread for the master's table ever since. The rook had been replaced by 2 sparrows. The village was very quiet. The poison was meant for Gerald, Bramley said. Gerald was in the guest of honor's chair. The wheatsheaf crust was, by ancient custom, destined for him. Agnes had waited 29 years for Gerald to return to Thornfield Magna. When he sat in that chair, she had her certainty. Miss Marple folded her gloved hands in her lap. But Edmund took the crust himself. He could not bear to let his brother have even that much precedence at his own table. And so Edmund died by his own vanity, and Agnes's certainty became something else entirely. Bramley stood. He put his hat back on. I'll need to speak with her. If you might allow me 10 minutes first, Miss Marple said. I think she already knows you are coming. And there are things she may say more readily to another woman of a certain age. He hesitated. Then he nodded, and sat back down to wait. Chapter 10. The Recipe Card Decoded. The bakery was very quiet. The smell of the morning's baking had faded, replaced by the cold scent of raw flour and old wood. Agnes Prentice was sitting in the wooden chair behind the counter, her hands folded in her lap with the perfect stillness of someone who has been sitting in exactly that position in her mind for a very long time, and has finally allowed her body to catch up. She looked up when Miss Marple entered. She did not look surprised. You have worked it out, Agnes said. It was not a question. I have, Miss Marple said, stepping up to the counter. I wondered if I might sit with you a moment. Agnes gestured to the low stool on the customer's side of the counter, and Miss Marple settled onto it, taking off her gloves and folding them in her lap. There was no urgency in the room, though the inspector's shadow fell outside the window glass at regular intervals as he paced. The recipe card, Miss Marple said gently. Your grandmother's joke, you called it. But it wasn't her joke, was it? It was yours. You wrote it. Agnes said nothing. Her hands lay still. For ounces of malice, that is for grams of aconitine, which you extracted from the monkshood plants in your garden border. I noticed them when I passed your gate. They bloom very handsomely, and you have a great many of them. Prove for exactly as long as a grudge will keep, 29 years and 4 months, since April of 1893, when Thomas lost the farm. Add decoration at 4 parts per 100, the concentration of the extract mixed only into the decorative wheatsheaf paste, not into the body of the loaf. Enough, at that concentration and at that quantity, to kill one person. Only one. Agnes's eyes, which had been fixed on the floor, slowly lifted. They were dry. They were very tired. "I extracted the monkshood over the summer," she said, in the flat, factual tone of a woman reciting a recipe, which was, Miss Marple supposed, precisely what she was doing. A long reduction. I made certain of the concentration. In September, when I knew Gerald was coming home, the village gossips told me before Edmund had the chance I made up the decorative paste separately from the dough itself. I did it at night, when Clara was asleep. The paste was sealed in its own tin. On the morning of the supper, I made the loaf as I have always made it. I used the paste only on the wheatsheaf crust. I pressed the stamp into it. I carried it to the marquee myself, as I have always carried it. She fell silent. "Gerald," Miss Marple said. "You wanted Gerald." Gerald stood up in the county court, Agnes said, and her voice changed and not raised, but deepened, the way a river deepens when it passes from a narrow channel into something wider and older, and told the magistrate that Thomas Prentice had signed away the lease. That Thomas had come to Edmund's father of his own free will and agreed to surrender the land in exchange for the clearing of a debt. It was a lie. I know it was a lie, because I was there when Thomas signed nothing, because there was nothing to sign, because the lease was not in dispute. The debt was real, but the lease was not security for it. Gerald lied under oath. He was 22 years old and he did what the estate needed him to do, and Thomas lost the farm. And Thomas died, Miss Marple said. 2 years later. He had no constitution for shame. He was a proud man, a good farmer, a man who believed in honest dealing. To be called a liar in open court, to lose the land his grandfather broke, she stopped. She breathed once, carefully. He faded. By the winter of '95 he was gone. I had Clara's mother to raise. So I stayed. I baked their bread. I stood behind that counter and I smiled, and I sold the Hartley Vane household their weekly loaf, and I pressed that family's crest into the top of it every harvest, and I waited. You waited for Gerald to come back, Miss Marple said. He was always going to come back eventually. Edmund had no sons. Gerald was the heir. When they said he was returning, that he would be the guest of honor, I knew it was the right moment. The old custom would carry the poison to exactly the right person. No one would suspect the bread was anything but communal. And even if they did, even if someone worked out that the crust was the vehicle that Agnes Prentice had made that crust every year for 40 years, and no one would know whose hands had touched the dough before mine. She looked down. That part was even true, at the beginning. No one knew. But Edmund took the crust, Miss Marple said. Agnes closed her eyes. She stayed that way for several seconds. Edmund took the crust. He could not help himself. He was incapable of letting Gerald have even a moment of honor without inserting himself into it. I had built a certainty I had relied on 40 years of custom, 40 years of Edmund Hartley Vane doing exactly what Thornfield Magna expected of him in that chair, and the one time he departed from his character, someone else paid for it. She opened her eyes. I killed a man who did not deserve to die. And the man who did is still alive. I have been sitting here for 4 days trying to understand whether God is laughing at me, or punishing me, or simply indifferent. Miss Marple looked at her very steadily. I think, she said, that God is rarely laughing. And that punishment, in cases like yours, has a way of arriving from unexpected directions. Agnes stood. She smoothed her apron, a small, precise gesture, the same gesture she had made 10,000 mornings, before lifting the day's first loaf from the oven. Clara and Oliver will be married, I think. In the spring. Something moved across her face. She is not bitter. Neither is he. The bitterness stops here. She walked out from behind the counter with her slow, deliberate step, and opened the bakery door. Inspector Bramley, who had been waiting outside with the patience he was paid for, stepped forward. Agnes Prentice walked out to meet him without being asked, and without looking back. Miss Marple remained in the shop for a long moment. Then she walked through to the kitchen, where the carved bread stamp sat on the large flour-dusted table, exactly as it had always Saturday. The sheaf of wheat pressed into the pear would look back at her, worn smooth, patient in the particular way of objects that have outlasted all the hands that made them useful. Outside, the village continued. A cart on the high street. The bell of the school door. Someone's dog barking twice, then stopping. The October sky beyond the kitchen window was pale and wide, the last of the year's color bleeding out of it into grey. The bread stamp sat in the quiet room. It would sit there still when Agnes was gone, because it belonged to the Hartley Vane estate, as everything in Thornfield Magna ultimately did, and because the village would need a baker for next year's harvest, and the year after that, and whatever had happened here would settle, gradually, into the particular silence of old things that a village does not care to re-examine. Miss Marple pulled her cardigan straight, put on her gloves, and went out into the morning. Thank you for spending this hour with me. I'm Jack. This has been Midnight Pages, and if this one stayed with you the way it stayed with me, leave me a thought in the comments. I read every single one. Subscribe if you haven't, share this with someone who loves a good mystery, and I'll see you in the next chapter. Until then, sleep well, and watch what grows in the quiet places.